My name's Nathan. I'm the third-generation keeper of Stormwatch Lighthouse. It's been in my family for as long as I can remember. My grandfather, he used to tell me stories about the lighthouse. He said it wasn't just a structure to warn ships. He called it a beacon, not just for the waters, but for us. He made it sound like it was more than just a job. It was a responsibility, something sacred. And when he passed, it became my father's job. He took over and carried on the tradition like it was his whole life. And in some ways, I guess it was. But my father wasn't just a keeper of the lighthouse. He was a man of rules. The job wasn't just about shining a light through the storm. There were certain ways things had to be done. Certain rituals, you could say. I didn't get it when I was younger, but now, it's like I'm starting to see what he meant. He disappeared during one of the worst storms this coast had seen in decades. I was just a teenager when it happened. They said he fell overboard or got swept away by the sea. But when they found his hat, tangled on the rocks below the lighthouse, they knew it wasn't just a freak accident. Something happened that night. Something more than nature could explain. After he disappeared, I wasn't really sure if I wanted to take this job. But here I am, and it's all mine now. Stormwatch is my responsibility, and I'm determined to figure out what happened to my father. What really happened? When I first came up here, I found his journal, drenched and falling apart from the water. The pages were stained and barely readable, but some of it was still legible. And in between the half-sentences and scratched-out words, I found something strange. He wrote about the rules. Strange rules about how things needed to be done here. Things I didn't understand. It made me think he knew something I didn't, or maybe, just maybe, he was trying to warn me. But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think there was anything more to the lighthouse than the storms and the work. But that first night alone, something felt off. Something felt wrong. I thought I'd get used to it, the isolation, the wind, the pounding rain that never stops. But the more I stay here, the more I hear those whispers in the dark. Sometimes, I feel like I'm not alone, even though the place is empty. I shake it off, tell myself it's just the wind or my mind playing tricks. But then, every now and then, I come across the journal again, and I start to wonder if the rules my father wrote down, rules I had ignored, meant something more. The storm rolled in that night like a beast, the wind howling and battering the lighthouse. I could hear the waves crashing against the cliffs far below. It was always bad during storms, but this one felt different. It felt like something was watching, something waiting. I kept the light running, following the standard procedure, though I wasn't sure what was going on outside. I knew the storm was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for the eerie silence that followed the roar of the winds. I remember the wind stopped for a second, just a second. The whole place went quiet. I looked out through the thick glass of the lighthouse window. I couldn't see much through the sheets of rain, but there was someone, standing on the rocks just below the lighthouse. I froze. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I focused, I realized it was a figure. A silhouette, tall and dark, like a person. And the worst part, I could swear it was my father. I squinted. The figure just stood there, unmoving. The storm howled again, and I could barely hear myself think over the noise. But that figure, it didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring, but I knew deep down something wasn't right. Something was wrong with the whole situation. I didn't even think. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out, but as I opened the door, a cold gust of wind slammed it shut behind me. The chill cut through me like ice, and I stumbled down the steps of the lighthouse, barely able to keep my footing with the wind pushing against me. I could see nothing but the blur of rain and waves crashing violently against the rocks. The figure was still there. I started running toward it, ignoring the sharp rocks digging into my boots. I was closer now, and I could see it clearer. The figure wasn't my father. It wasn't anyone. It was a shadow, a dark shape that seemed to blend with the storm itself. And that's when I remembered one of the rules my father had written down in his journal. Never look directly into the storm's eye. I didn't know why he wrote that, but now, standing there, I felt it. The figure was like a part of the storm itself. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I shouldn't be here. I felt a shiver run through me, and I knew I had to get back. I turned and ran, slipping on the wet rocks, my breath ragged in my chest. As I made my way back to the lighthouse, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The figure was gone, but the storm was still there, raging. The next few days felt like a blur. I spent hours each night poring over my father's journal, trying to make sense of his cryptic notes. The pages were old, weathered, and most of it was nearly unreadable, but I could make out just enough to see a pattern. He had written about the storms, the strange occurrences at the lighthouse, and the rules he had followed. But the more I read, the more I realized my father wasn't just documenting the day-to-day operations. No, there was something darker here. He seemed to be warning me. The journal was full of his own words. Never let the storm catch you alone. Don't trust the light in the dark, and follow the routine, or you'll end up like me. The last one stood out. Don't break the cycle. It's the only thing that keeps us safe. I had no idea what he meant by it, but it gave me a chill every time I read it. I thought I could shake it off. That's what you do when you're young, right? You think you're invincible, like nothing can touch you. But the more time I spent here, the more those words haunted me. The storm kept coming. It was relentless, as if it had a mind of its own. The wind howled like an animal, beating against the lighthouse as though trying to tear it down. There were nights when it felt like the storm was alive, twisting and turning in unnatural ways, coming from directions that shouldn't have made sense. One night, as the rain lashed against the windows, I heard a noise coming from the tower. It was faint at first, like a whispering wind, but it grew louder. I decided to investigate. Climbing the stairs of the lighthouse felt like walking into a tomb. The walls seemed to close in around me as I reached the top. I turned the corner to the light chamber, and that's when I saw it, an object on the floor near the base of the light. It was my father's lantern. It shouldn't have been there. It wasn't supposed to leave the lamp room. I picked it up. The glass was fogged with moisture, but the flame inside it was still burning, steady and bright. I froze. That's when I remembered the rule. Never allow the lantern to go out, no matter what. It wasn't just a safety precaution. The lantern was part of something bigger, something my father had always warned me about. He had kept the lantern lit for a reason. But now I was holding it. The light was flickering. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd let it go out. Was it my fault? Had the storm somehow reached inside the lighthouse? Was I breaking something by holding it? I looked out through the thick glass of the lighthouse. The storm was worse than ever, the waves crashing against the rocks, pushing the water higher, closer. I was starting to wonder if the lighthouse, the rules, and the storm were all connected somehow. If breaking one rule meant something worse was coming. I tried to make sense of it all. It was one of the worst storms I'd ever witnessed. The wind was shrieking, pushing against the lighthouse with a force I couldn't explain. The lantern still flickered in my hand, but I knew something wasn't right. The more I thought about my father's journal, the more I realized there were rules I hadn't even begun to understand. It was late when I first saw it, the figure standing outside. I couldn't believe my eyes. For a second, I thought it was another person, maybe a fisherman who'd gotten caught in the storm, but no. It was a shadow, a dark silhouette standing on the rocks far below. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to dismiss it, but I knew deep down it wasn't a trick of the storm or the rain. This wasn't normal. I remembered what my father had said in the journal. Never break the routine. The lighthouse runs on it. I didn't know what that meant, but in that moment, I knew I wasn't supposed to be out there in the storm. I should have stayed inside, followed the pattern. But that figure, who was it? What did it want? My instincts screamed at me to go back inside, but I couldn't. I stepped down from the lighthouse and into the blinding rain. The wind howled so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts, but I had to get closer to the rocks. There was someone waiting there calling to me, or at least that's what it felt like. As I walked closer, the rain seemed to get heavier, the wind fiercer. My boots slipped on the rocks, and I almost lost my footing. But I kept going. I had to see. I had to know. Then I heard it. A voice. Low and crackling, like it was coming from the storm itself. I turned around to see a man standing right behind me. His face was blurred, almost as if it was made of shadows. He reached out for me, and that's when I remembered the second rule: never let anyone touch you during the storm. I froze. His hands were cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt. I pulled back, stumbling on the rocks as I ran for cover. The figure, whatever it was, didn't follow, but I could still feel its presence in the storm. I ran back to the lighthouse, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing. I was shaking. I couldn't explain what had just happened. What had I seen? Who was that man? Was it even a man? The storm raged on, and I realized something terrifying. The rules weren't just precautions. They were the only things keeping whatever was out there away. My father had followed them for years, and now I was the one left to follow them. The question was, would I be able to keep up the routine? Or would the storm claim me too? The storm didn't let up. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger. Waves slammed into the rocks like they were trying to tear the coastline apart. The wind howled, and the rain felt like it was being driven by 1,000 invisible hands. I kept the lantern burning, like my father had always done, but it didn't seem to help. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then it got louder. There were voices, low, indistinct, coming from somewhere deep within the lighthouse itself. I didn't know what to make of it. I had read enough in the journal to know that my father had mentioned hearing things too, voices, shadows, whispers in the storm. But I always assumed it was just the wind, or maybe a trick of the isolation. Now though, I wasn't so sure. I stood by the light, peering through the windows, trying to see if anything was out there. There was nothing, just the storm, battering the rocks below. But the whispers, they didn't stop. They were coming from behind me, like they were circling around the lighthouse. I thought about the rules my father had written down. I remembered the first rule he had written, but I didn't understand it completely until then. The storm never stops. It only waits. Never ignore the light. Never turn your back on it. It was about more than the lantern, I realized. It was about the lighthouse itself, the light that kept the storm at bay. The more I thought about it, the more I understood. This wasn't just about keeping the lighthouse running. It was about ensuring the light never flickered, that it never went out. But the whispers were louder now. It was as if they were coming from the walls themselves. It felt like someone, was inside the lighthouse with me. I turned away from the window and headed back to the spiral staircase. I didn't want to go down there, into the belly of the lighthouse, but I couldn't ignore it. The whispers were becoming clearer, and I had to know what they were. I descended into the lower levels of the lighthouse. The air was damp, the smell of salt and mildew thick in the darkened halls. The wind outside rattled the windows, but it felt like the storm was being swallowed by the stone walls around me. It was eerily quiet inside. As I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The walls weren't just weathered from the storm. They looked as if they were worn from years of something else. Like the lighthouse itself was alive, absorbing every storm, every whisper, every secret. I reached the lowest level of the lighthouse and found the source of the whispers. It was an old, rusted door, one that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't even in the journal. My father had never mentioned it, but there it was, standing at the farthest corner of the basement, just beyond the reach of the lantern light. I approached slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whispers were louder now, almost frantic. I put my hand on the cold metal of the door, but before I could turn the handle, the voice came again. This time it was clear. "Do not open it." The voice was low, deep, and chilling. It sounded like a man, but there was something unnatural about it. Something hollow. I froze. The storm outside roared louder, and the wind howled through the cracks in the lighthouse. But the voice, there was no mistaking it. It was telling me something important. It was a warning. I took a step back from the door. I didn't know what was behind it, but something told me that breaking the rule might cost me everything. I turned to leave. But just before I could, I saw it, scratched into the wood of the door in deep, jagged lines. The third rule: never open the door. The storm waits on the other side. The words were carved with an urgency I couldn't ignore. I took one last look at the door, heart pounding in my chest, and then I turned away. But as I climbed back up the stairs, I heard it again, louder this time, almost deafening. "Don't break the cycle." It was my father's voice. I knew it. He had been here. He had warned me. I was breaking something I didn't fully understand yet. But whatever it was, I had to figure it out before it was too late. That night, the storm raged harder than ever. The lighthouse trembled as the wind battered it with relentless force. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I'd felt it before, but tonight it was worse. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deep, unnerving silence. I checked the lantern, making sure the light was still burning brightly. It had become my focus, my obsession. It was the only thing that kept the darkness from swallowing me whole. But the more I looked at it, the more I noticed something strange. The shadows around the lantern seemed different. They were moving, shifting as if they were alive. It didn't make sense. I was alone in the lighthouse. Or so I thought. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw it. In the reflection of the glass, there were eyes, glowing eyes, staring back at me from the dark. They weren't human eyes, not even close. They were the eyes of something ancient, something that had been waiting in the storm. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. My breath was heavy, my pulse racing. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was losing it. The isolation, the endless nights alone in the lighthouse, it had to be getting to me. But then the eyes appeared again, this time in the reflection of the windows. They were closer now. I stepped back, my mind racing. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was I seeing things? Or was there something inside the lighthouse with me, something I wasn't meant to find? The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "The storm won't stop." It's never stopped. I didn't need to look at the journal to understand. This was the rule I had feared the most. Never let the storm in. Never open your heart to it. I realized then, with a sickening clarity, that the storm wasn't just something that happened outside. It was a presence, something that lived and breathed within the lighthouse. My father had known this, but he hadn't been able to stop it. He had failed. And now it was my turn. The next few hours felt like they lasted days. I couldn't sleep. The shadows, the eyes, they haunted every corner of the lighthouse. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. The storm was no longer just a force of nature. It was a force of something darker, something older than I could comprehend. I went back to my father's journal. The pages were damp and fragile, but I had memorized every word. I read it over and over, hoping for something I had missed. And then, in the middle of the pages, I found it. A note, written in my father's handwriting. It was different from the rest of the journal. It wasn't a rule. It was a plea. If you read this, it means I'm gone. I've failed. The storm is the lighthouse. The lighthouse is the storm. It's bound to us, and we are bound to it. I couldn't escape. Neither can you. I closed the journal with shaking hands. I didn't know what to think. The words blurred in front of me, but one thing was clear. My father had known this. He had known the lighthouse was cursed, that it was a prison, not just for the souls trapped by the storm, but for the keepers too. I didn't know what to do next. The storm was louder now, crashing against the lighthouse with fury. The wind howled through the cracks, and the lighthouse groaned like it was alive, like it was screaming. The walls seemed to move, shifting with the force of the storm. I thought about what I had read. The rules, the warnings, the pleas for help from my father. And then I realized something else. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping the storm at bay. It was feeding on the storm, feeding on the fear, on the souls it trapped. It was feeding on us. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The cycle had to end. I had to end it. The lighthouse was shaking now, the walls groaning like they were being pulled apart. The storm outside was deafening. It felt like the whole world was collapsing in on itself. I could hear the voices again, the whispers, the cries, but they weren't just outside. They were in my head. They were coming from the lighthouse itself, from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air I breathed. I was losing my mind. I had to get out. I had to escape. But I knew deep down that there was no escape. The storm had been here longer than I had. It had been here long before my father. and it was going to be here long after I was gone. I walked into the light room one last time, the lantern flickering as the wind howled louder than before. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I was so tired, but I had come this far. I had read the journal, I had learned the rules. I had lived them, I had followed them, and still nothing had changed. I thought about the last words my father had written. The storm is the lighthouse. The lighthouse is the storm. I understood now. The storm wasn't just an external force. It wasn't just the wind and the waves. It was part of the lighthouse. It always had been. And we, the keepers, we were part of it too. We couldn't escape it. We were bound to it, just like my father had been. I had to make a choice. I had to break the cycle. I had to destroy the lighthouse, even if it meant destroying myself in the process. It was a choice that had to be made for both me and my father. I made my way over to the control panel for the lantern, my hands shaking. I didn't know if I was ready for this, but the feeling of helplessness had grown unbearable. I slammed my fist onto the panel, triggering a spark of life in the light. It flickered, one last, desperate attempt to stay alive. But that was all it could do. The light sputtered and went out, casting the room into complete darkness. For a moment, I stood there, heart hammering in my chest. The storm was deafening now, as if the very wind and rain were screaming in fury at me. The lighthouse groaned again, and I could hear the walls creaking under the pressure. The storm wasn't done with me. It wasn't going to let go without a fight, but I wasn't going to let it win. I reached into the control panel again, my fingers trembling as I pulled out the wires. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if this would work or if it would destroy everything. But I couldn't stand it anymore. The whispers in my head, the cries, the feeling of being trapped, something inside me snapped. I had to end it. I had to break the cycle. I shoved the wires together. Sparks flew, illuminating the room with flashes of electric blue and orange. The ground beneath me shuddered. I heard the walls crack and the windows shatter in the distance. The explosion came so suddenly, so violently, that I couldn't even scream. The room lit up in a blinding flash, and the world seemed to stop. There was a shock wave that knocked me off my feet, and for a split second, everything was silent. I couldn't hear the storm anymore. I couldn't hear the wind or the waves crashing. All I could hear was the deafening ringing in my ears. Then, slowly, everything returned. The storm outside, the wind, the waves, everything that had been part of this place, seemed to fade. The winds died down. The waves slowed. And for the first time in years, I felt peace. I could feel it. The weight of the lighthouse, the curse, the storm, everything that had bound me was gone. The storm had broken, its grip loosening. It was over. And my father, he was free. I woke up to the sound of waves lapping gently against the rocks below. The storm had passed. The air was still calm, like it had never been disturbed. I was lying in the sand, the charred remains of the lighthouse burning in the distance. I couldn't believe it. I had done it. I had broken the cycle. I stood up slowly, my body sore from the heat of the flames. The remains of the lighthouse were a hollow shell now, the beacon long gone. But somehow I felt lighter. I felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from my chest. I walked down the beach, the cool air biting at my skin. The sun was rising now, casting a warm, golden light over the wreckage of the lighthouse. I could see the smoke rising in the distance, but it didn't feel ominous anymore. It felt like a part of the past, like something that had finally been put to rest. I clutched my father's journal tightly in my hand. It had been my guide through this nightmare. It had helped me understand the truth, even when I didn't want to know it. And now, it was the only thing I had left of him. I remembered the last thing my father had said in his journal. The storm won't stop. It only waits. But it will never take you again. I believed him. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could move on. I could live without the storm, without the lighthouse. As I walked away from the remains of the lighthouse, I felt a sense of peace. The storm had claimed my father, but it hadn't claimed me. And now I was free. I looked back one last time, but the lighthouse was gone, consumed by fire and time. The storm's legacy had finally ended. What do you think would be the best name for this story in just 2 or 3 words? Drop your ideas in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for daily horror stories that get creepier every night.